Bob Scoff is 77 years old, and a few Christmases ago, he lives in rural Iowa, and he had a septic tank. Some of you live on acre lots here in the East Valley, so you know what we're talking about. And on Christmas Eve, Bob Scoff's toilets were not flushing right. The septic tank was jammed and clogged, and so he went out back. The sun was just setting. There was a little bit of daylight. And he opened a trap door to where he could get to the line that came from the house that fed the septic tank. And he leaned into this hole. It's just about 18 inches, but he could squeeze down in there, and he's holding himself up with one hand, and he manages to reach in and pull this wad of toilet paper out. But just as he pulls it out, his left hand slips, and it plunges him head first, but it's just an 18-inch wide opening, and so he's wedged upside down in this pipe, and he says in a Superman-like pose, like this, upside down, if you can picture that. And then he realizes quickly he's upside down, dangling over the sewer, and he can't get free. And he's trying to yell, but his head is buried in a pit, and he can't see anything, and it's as dark as night in there. But he can smell everything that's close. He says, but now, luckily, he has freed the toilet paper, but now everything's flowing nicely from the house right below his nose. And he's there for 1 hour, 2 hours. And Bob Scoff, 77 years old, he says, I started to think, man, 77 years of my life, and here's how it's going to end. Upside down in a septic tank, dangling there with my feet straight up in the air. His wife didn't know what happened to him. She went through the night thinking, well, maybe he's out with friends. The next day, they finally started to look for him, and they found his legs sticking out. They thought maybe he's frozen to death, and he said he thought he was going to die, but he said, fortunately, everything below him was warm and keeping his body alive. They pulled him out, and the first thing they did was give him a bath, and I have a picture of Bob Scoff right here. And they scrubbed him. We did have a picture at one time. There we go. There he is. Cleaned up. This is him from Iowa. All right, that's enough. Thank you so much. We can move on from that. So I told my staff when I was this morning or last week, I said, I don't know how I'm going to get from that story to the Bible, but we're going to try. In Psalm chapter 40, David writes about the pits of life. We have this series we started talking about 40-day stories. This is a Psalm 40 story. And so turn your Bibles there, and he describes the pits of life as slimy, just like Bob Scoff's story. The Psalms work like this. The Psalms show us the flow of life, the ebbs and flow, the ups and downs. And Psalm 40 is about this ebb and flow of life where we are in the pit and God pulls us out, and then we're in again and he pulls us back out. So follow along as I read. I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and he heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and the mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear the Lord and put their trust in him. Psalm 40 is for everyone who's cried. Psalm 40 is for everyone who's crashed a car, everyone who's moved out of state, lost a job, lost a father, lost a mother. Everyone who's had a teenager rebel. Psalm 40 is for everyone who's felt bankrupt, gone bankrupt, foreclosed on a house. Psalm 40 is for anyone who's had a marriage break apart, anyone who's managed a broken family. Psalm 40 is for everyone who's felt like their dreams have faded away and there's no hope for the future. Psalm 40 says that there is. And so I want to look at this psalm this morning and see what David is trying to teach us, how to get out of the pits of life. First of all, let's start with how do we end up in the kind of pit that David is writing about here in Psalm 40? Because if you think about it, not all the time, but a lot of the times, we create the pit and we end up there ourselves. That's what he goes on to say. This is Psalm chapter 7, verse 15. Whoever digs a hole and scoops it out falls into the pit they have made. If you think about the pits that you've been in, sometimes, maybe most of the time, You're there because you put yourself there. For example, this is just hypothetical, but let's say you're in the Olympics, you've qualified, and your team that you're on wins a gold medal. And the last day that you're in Brazil, in Rio, you decide to go out with your buddies who also won a gold medal with you. This is just a hypothetical story. And you're out till 6 in the morning, and you're trying to get into a gas station bathroom, and it's locked, so you kick the door down, and then you say, well, the police robbed us at gunpoint. You just make that up. And then you just make it worse. Not that that actually happened. But isn't that what we usually end up doing? The problems in life start when we are dishonest, we break someone's trust, we tell something that's not true, we take something that is not ours, we give in to an addiction. But here's the good news of it all. I have this key idea on the screen, and you can write this down. We have a page in the devotional we've been handing out for notes. Write this in there. It's usually our own fault, isn't it? Not every time that we end up in the pits of life. The good news is God is always willing to pull us back up on our feet. And the surprising implication is that everyone, anyone, you and me, can be the spiritual kind of people that God made us to be. If you look at the characters in the Bible, like David himself who writes this psalm, but you name them, they had a long list of problems. The characters in the Bible were imperfect. They had hang-ups. They had shortcomings. Spirituality, when we are spiritual people, it's not a straight line. We don't walk a smooth path. Spirituality is messy and complicated and confusing and sloppy, and we make mistakes, and God takes us back. In verse 12, if you look back at this with me, we read, "Troubles without number surround me. My sins have overtaken me." So those who write about Psalm 40 say he's writing about two pits. He's writing about one in verses 1 through 3, and then he's back in the pit again when we get to verses 11, 12, 13. Part of what I want to do today is to deconstruct the idea that Christians are perfect. You know, that's just the perception that I think a lot of people have of Christians, but maybe it's the persona that we tend to try to give off to those in the world or to each other. I was raised in a culture of Christian perfectionism. That was what it was like. You never heard about people's sins because they never talked about it. Maybe in hushed tones you would hear about people's sins. People sometimes would use this language. Oh, they are a backslider. You did not want to be a backslider. That was the worst of the insults. Who knows what sin that involved? But we didn't talk openly about them because people were ashamed and shamed by their mistakes. Nobody was shown the grace that Jesus talks about much. Most of you know I grew up as a missionary kid. And what happened on the mission field a lot of times is if a kid made a big mistake, they just disappeared. You know, like they had been abducted somewhere in the Amazon jungle by rebels. They just disappeared. You'd wake up one morning, that kid's gone, you know. This actually happened. Often they would send him off to some remote, faraway boarding school or find a really mean-spirited military school in the United States and send him here. And some poor soul, but you never knew what happened because we were hiding our sins. We're trying to act perfect. And then Jesus comes along and he presents this way of hope and salvation for imperfect people. The most religious of his day, they bucked it. They didn't like it. They didn't like that. They called his kind of faith loose. People talked about it as though it was scandalous because he kept showing grace to the ones who messed up and made mistakes. And I want you to know today, if you don't know this about the Grove, this is a church where regardless of your background or your history or your mistakes or your failures or your pits that you've been in, and maybe you're still in one today, you are wanted here. You don't have to keep hiding. There's no one here who's going to shame you. And we simply want to make the grace of Jesus Christ come alive here in Chandler and in Gilbert. So if you've put in time in the pit, the question we all ask is, how do we get out? So let's go back to verse 1. And here's what David does. The first thing we read is he says, I waited patiently for the Lord. It seems too easy, but can I just say, Maybe it's so hard for us as American Christians because we don't like to wait for anything. But he says, I just waited. I waited patiently for the Lord until he turned to me. I'm going to be straight with you. I'm right there with you, with all of you that can't stand waiting. I can't stand waiting in traffic. I can't stand waiting at the DMV. I lost my driver's license recently. I had to go up there. It's a living nightmare. Can I just say that? My number was like E146. Can I tell you how many letters and numbers go before that? It's virtual infinity. I can't wait. I was sent to the grocery store this last week. I don't get there often. And I saw the line. I'm like, I'm not going to get stuck in that nightmare. So I go to, there's nobody at self-checkout. And then I got there. There's a reason why nobody's at self-checkout. It's flawed technology. Okay, I'm just going to tell you, it's failed because I must have hit call the attendant 4 times. And the people in the back of the lines in the regular, they're all gone. They're home having dinner. And I'm fooling with self-checkout. They've done studies on why we hate waiting. Do you know that we don't mind a slow, short line? What we don't like is a long, quick line. It doesn't matter how quick it is. That's why Disneyland, they deceive you. You think you've gotten into the Matterhorn. No, you're not. The line it's weaving around. They hide the line from you. You know that a lot of companies know that you want your food especially fast. And so like Domino's, not too long ago, they promised your pizza in 30 minutes or it's free. It was like if you went out on a Friday night at 6 o'clock, right? It was like Grand Theft Auto out there. There's so many Domino's drivers driving fast. You're taking your life in your hands. And then Denny's about the same time said, we'll give you your food in 10 minutes. And they literally put, it's not called a stopwatch. What is it? A timer. They put like an egg timer on and you would turn the dial and you would get let's say you ordered country fried steak. By the way, I found out it's not actually steak. It's battered deep fried hamburger. I'm just telling you what's happening there. But you don't want anything battered deep fried from Denny's in 10 minutes. You don't want that. Salmonella's just waiting for you, And then some of you remember McDonald's 1 minute. This didn't last too long. 1 minute. We want our junk food fast and quick. Do you know why they put mirrors by elevators? Because they feel if they can keep you busy, looking at yourself, making sure you're ready for the next selfie, then you won't complain so much. Hobby Airport in Houston, this is true. They had realized that they were getting all of these complaints from people who were waiting for their bags. Because at Hobby, it used to be when you landed, it only took you 1 minute, less than 2 minutes, like a minute and a half to get from the gate to baggage claim. But then people were getting to baggage claim, and it was taking an average of 8 minutes to get their luggage. And people going, 8 minutes, I could have, what could I do in 8 minutes? And so here's what Hobby did. It sounds evil. They created a rat maze. And so they have people now walking all over the airport. Now it takes 9 minutes to get, they just detoured everyone. 9 minutes. You get to the baggage claim, and there's your bags. You go, oh, that's nothing at all. Let's not talk about Sky Harbor. It's about 28 minutes from the gate to baggage claim, and then another 46 minutes to get your bag. I don't know what's happening. There's like a lunch break every time I show up for my bags. But we, as American Western Christians, we don't want to wait on God. And David says, I just waited patiently for the Lord. Here's what Isaiah says in another 40. This is Isaiah 40, verse 31. Those who waited on the Lord will renew their strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not grow tired. They will walk and not be faint. Can I tell you what God is doing? In the pits of life, you're not waiting there in vain. You're waiting there, and he's working in your soul. It's not wasted time. You think it's wasted time. All you want is out. But God's timing is not your timing. And while you're in there, while you're in the pits of life, I believe this strongly, there's a kind of spirituality. There's a part of our faith that only grows and shapes. There's a part of our spiritual maturity that only happens when we're sitting in the pit waiting for God to work. So David says, I just waited. Well, what happens next? And then the psalmist says, he heard my cry. He turned to me in verse 2, and he heard my cry. There's two questions everyone asks in the pit. The first one is, does God hear me? Is God silent? And he's not. He just wants you to wait for him. And then the second one is, why, God, are you letting this happen to me? It's a question I hear almost every time something happens really desperate to a family or to an individual. We all say, why do the worst things happen to the best people? Theologians for centuries have called it the problem of pain. If God is all powerful, and if God is all good, and if God is all loving, and if God is in control of it all, then why do the very worst things happen to our children, or to our mothers, or to our fathers, or to our husbands, or to our wives? If God is all powerful and all good, then why are there bombings in Brussels? Why are there floods in Louisiana? Why is there malaria in Africa? And what I want to say this morning is that maybe we don't know every time what the answer is to that why. But I think the mistake many Christians make is that we give sometimes really cheap, glib, false answers to that problem. I've heard Christians say things like, well, if you had more faith, you wouldn't deal with that. Or sometimes preachers make it worse and they say God is judging you for your sin, as though God doesn't judge preachers. There's one preacher in the Northwest getting a lot of press saying that God hates you, and that's not the truth of Scripture at all. Sometimes we give people really trite, glib answers like, God will not give you more than you can handle. That line's not even in the Bible. And the truth is that some of you right now have been dealing with things that are so overwhelming, you feel like you're drowning. You feel like you can't take anymore. I think that happens to families and individuals and couples all the time. But what David is trying to get us to see is that when we are in that pit and we cry out to God, he listens. And David writes these words, he heard my cry. And so I want to say this morning, when David says he heard my cry, if you know David's story, he put himself in the pit and his sin with Bathsheba. And now he's finally crying out and he's confessing and he's admitting and he's acknowledging that he's made a mistake. And I think one of the first things, when you realize you're in the pit of life, then can I say, confess. Be honest. Stop hiding. God already knows it. Come to him and say, God, I have made the biggest mistake of my life. And acknowledge it. And then when we do, he hears us. And here's what we read next. Well, I'll just read this. This is verse 12. Troubles without number surround me. My sins have overtaken me. I cannot see. He's finally confessing, finally admitting that he needs God to save him. And then we read this next in Psalm 40. This is down in verse 3. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and the mire, and he set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. Can you get that visual image that God goes into action when he hears David? And David says, he pulled me up out of the pit. This last week, I mentioned Louisiana. There was drastic flooding again. And then I think it was Monday or Tuesday. Let's hit play on that. I have this video. There's a woman trapped in a car. The car is sinking. And this guy jumps in, and with his bare hands, she's inside, by the way, with her dog. He pulls that roof open. He gets her arm out first. And he pulls her out. This guy's amazing. And then she's saying, get my dog. And if you could hear the sound, he had first asked for a knife. He wanted to cut the roof open. And the guy's getting him a knife. It's like asking at a dental convention if anyone has dental floss. Everyone in Louisiana has a knife. And so he gets her out. And then he goes back down looking for her dog. This is the man. And there he is. He comes back up. We're not going to turn it off yet. He's got the dog. There we go. The dog's alive. See, we can apply. I don't even know this guy's name. We need his name. That was like Tuesday. But do you see what he goes in with his bare hands and rips that roof open, and then he pulls her out. I can't think of anything in life more frightening than that. Listen what David says. This is Psalm 137, verse 4. He says, he reached down from on high and took hold of me. David's saying he reached down and he grabbed onto me. I think some people think they need to make the pit their home. And I want to say, it's time to get out. There's some people that start to do interior decorating in the pit. They think they're going to be there forever. And if you've been in life's pit, I want to say it's time to say, God, get me out of here. Some people think they need to get used to it. You don't need to get used to it. You're not meant to stay there. There's a Latin phrase I've shared before here a while ago. It's called the Manus Dei, or Manus Dei. It's the hand of God. Manus is hand, the great, giant hand of God. We keep reading about this huge hand of God that reaches down from heaven. When I picture the hand of God, it's enormous. I, at one time in my life when I was in high school, was an aspiring, skinny basketball player. And the one thing that I always wanted to do was to be able to palm a basketball like Dr. J. Any Dr. J fans left in the world? All right, a few. When he held a basketball, it looked like he was palming a baseball, his fingers wrapped around it. I couldn't palm a basketball, so my twin brother and I would take duct tape and put it backwards on our fingers so the ball would stick. And then when we came out for warm-ups, we were like this, thinking these two skinny kids were going to scare the opponents. It was useless. But I always wanted to have hands like Dr. J or now like LeBron, big. Here's what we read about God's hands. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. And that's Isaiah, Psalm 139. Your right hand will hold me fast. Some of you are left-handed. It sounds like God's right-handed. I'm not saying anything there. I'm not trying to make a point. I'm just saying. All right. 1 Chronicles 4. Jabez says, let your hand be on me. John, this is Jesus, says, no one. He says, when I hold on to my children, no one can snatch them out of my hands. I think when I picture Jesus, I picture him with these big, strong arms and hands. We forget that Jesus was a carpenter, right? I think the way we talk about Jesus sometimes, it's just like all he did was sit around and hold kids on his lap and tell stories and go to Sun City and have milk toast and marshmallows. We kind of talk about Jesus as this nice old man. He's not. He was a construction worker. When he got mad, he would grab tables with his hands and flip them. When people were in trouble like Peter, he didn't say, hey, Peter, hope you can swim back to the boat. No, he reaches down and he pulls him up. He sees in a town of Nain that a boy is dead, so he reaches out and he pulls him off the stretcher with his strong hands. And those hands are there for you and for me. God never gives up on anyone. There's no one that he cannot pull out of the pit. He's strong enough for whatever pit you've ended up in. And as I say that about God, can I just encourage you to not give up on the people in your life who you love? I think sometimes fathers and mothers want to give up on children, don't. Sometimes husbands or wives want to give up on their spouse. Can I say don't? Sometimes we want to give up on our friends, don't. People hurt us. We think we can't heal. You can. Don't give up. God will never give up on you. And I would say the same for us. Here's the last point that David makes in this Psalm 40. In verse 3, he says this, he put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear the Lord and put their trust in you. And so I have here this morning, he has something brand new for your life. Maybe you've hit rock bottom right now, but maybe hitting rock bottom is the best thing that's ever happened. Because when you hit rock bottom in the pit, then you have to start over. And maybe that's okay. Maybe it's a brand new job, or maybe it's a brand new place to live. Maybe it's brand new friends, and maybe that's the best thing that will ever happen to you. God is very good at helping us start over. And David says, he's put a new song in my mouth. There's some people that go through life not singing, even singing from their heart. They're kind of grouchy all the time. I think those kinds of people never thrive. And David says, he'll put a song in your mouth, even if you've spent time in the pit. I want to end with this story just to paint a picture of what I'm trying to say this morning. When I was a young pastor, I had 2 college students in my ministry, and then I got to do their wedding. And then Veronica and I moved out of state. They're in another state. I'll just say, these aren't their names. I'll say his name is Ben. I'll say her name is Laura. And I'd been gone for about 3 months when he called me and he says, Palmer, things aren't going well. He said, our schedules don't match. You know, she works retail, so she's gone every night. And I work in the morning, so we never see each other. And then worse than that, now she's going out with her friends dancing at night after work. She's going clubbing without me, and which just seemed strange. And then he calls me back a month later with the worst news. He said, I just found out that on one night she went home with another man. And so he still told her he loved her. Then he calls me a month later and he says, Palmer, it's worse. Now she's pregnant. And we don't know if the baby is mine or it's this other man that she had gone home with. And Palmer, she's saying she doesn't love me anymore. And I said, well, what do you want to do? I mean, how do you feel? He says, Palmer, I still love her. And he said, I told her I forgive her, even though she hasn't asked me to forgive her. When he said that, I was like, man, I don't even know if I could say that. And so as we talked, he just decided to keep loving her and keep loving her, even though she said she didn't love him, and even though he or she didn't know if this baby she's carrying is his. And as he kept loving her, she started to love him back. The guy she had gone home with had gotten their home number and started to call their house. And she didn't want to see him anymore because she was falling in love with her husband again, a second time. And so finally, my friend, I said his name, we'll call him Ben, starts answering the phone and he said, quit calling my house. When he called me and he told me, the guy keeps calling the house and I'm telling him to quit calling. I gave him the most pastorly advice I could think of. I said, if you want me to, I'll get on a plane, we'll drive out, and we'll meet him in his parking lot. We were just going to talk and read the Bible. That was my plan, just pray with him. I don't know what I was saying. I was just mad for a friend. So his wife falls in love with him. 9 months later, she ends up in the delivery room. He calls me on his cell phone from the delivery room. He said, Palmer, you won't believe it. The guy who she thought maybe it was his baby, he's in the parking lot. I'm looking out the window at him. He wants to have a paternity test done. So now they have the baby, and then they have the paternity test done, and they have to wait 4 days. And he says those were the 4 longest days of his life. And then tests come back, and the baby is his and hers. And the story doesn't end there because they didn't just have one child. They have 5 children. And then it just didn't end there. Together, he and his wife planted a church. And now I still see them often. They're in another state. But when I see them at least a couple of times a year, I walk in their front door. And the first thing you see is there's a big grand piano at the entrance. And just about every time I walk through the door, he says, Palmer, I have a new song. I've just written, I'm not kidding you, every time I've written a new song. Sit down, let me play it for you. He keeps writing new songs. And I just say that to remind all of us that there's no pit in life that's too deep. There's nothing you've done that puts you too far away from God that he can't pull you back. With the great hand of God, he can bring you back to him. It's not too late. You're not too far. And maybe this morning it's time for you to say, God, take me out of this pit. I'm ready to come back to you.